very good morning to everyone. Welcome to ALCO, and today we begin the proceedings of the legal experts meeting to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the UNCLOS by inviting Professor Dr. Rahmat Mohammed, our Secretary General, to deliver the welcome remarks.
A very good morning to you all. Mr. Pinak Ranjan Chakrabarti, Secretary ER, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and the Chief Guest. Mr. Stephen Matthias, Assistant Secretary General for Legal Affairs, United Nations. Dr. Neeru Chadha, Joint Secretary, Legal and Treaty Divisions, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. Mr. B. Sen, our founding fathers of ALCO and the first Secretary General of ALCO. Excellencies, distinguished representative from Member State of ALCO, the expert panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a matter of great honor and privilege to have among us today Mr. Pinak Ranjan Chakrabarti, Secretary ER, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, who, despite his very busy schedule and onerous responsibilities, has spared his valuable time and has very kindly consented to address this august gathering. Mr. Chakrabarti has served both at Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, and Indian Mission abroad, including in Cairo, Jeddah, and London. On behalf of the organizers and on my own behalf, I thank you, sir, for your presence at this meeting, and we are confident that your address would set the tone for productive deliberations during the course of the meeting. I also take this opportunity to thank our co-organizer, the Legal and Treaties Division, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, in particular, Dr. Neeru Chadha, Joint Secretary, for readily accepting ALCO's proposal to jointly host this meeting of legal experts to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the historic 1982 UNCLOS. The support that we have received from the Government of India ever since ALCO inception specifically for this meeting is both noteworthy and praiseworthy. At this juncture, I wish to inform you that His Excellency Mr. Muhammad Bello Adoke, the Attorney General and Minister of Justice of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the current President of ALCO, had informed us that he would be here to attend this meeting. However, due to certain pressing matters at home, at the last moment he had to cancel his visit. Nevertheless, he has sent his best wishes for this meeting to be a success. Needless to say, I stay indebted to my predecessor, Mr. B. Sen, who has come to his home to give us an insight into his real-life experiences of having negotiated the tough and arduous process of the UNCLOS. The presence of Mr. Stephen Matthias, Assistant Secretary General for Legal Affairs, United Nations, here today is testament to the fact that ALCO, as the voice of Asia and Africa, holds a special and unique place within the United Nations system. I must admit that the response that I have received from the United Nations, the UNODC as well, as the galaxy of legal experts from the international law fraternity, some of whom have traveled long distances to be here today, is commendable and reaffirms our notion that even after 30 years of its establishment, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea remains significant despite new and upcoming challenges that have to be dealt with by the international community. I would like to make a special reference here to the fact that we also have amidst us today Mr. H.P. Rajan, who devoted most of his professional career to the law of the sea, first in the service of the Government of India, later as a senior staff member of the International Seabed Authority, and finally as one of the directors of the UN Legal Affairs Division. In fact, he started his career here at ALCO in the 70s and 80s. I also take this opportunity to warmly welcome each one of the representatives of ALCO member states and other distinguished participants, including students who are here with us today, and I'm confident that you all will greatly benefit from the proceedings of today. Today's meeting, as we are all aware, has been mandated and organized to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, an event that was widely celebrated the world over last year and culminated with the special session of the United Nations General Assembly on 10th and 11th December 2012, and the adoption of an initiative by the UN Secretary General entitled the Ocean Compact, Healthy Ocean for Prosperity. Thus, the 30th anniversary gives us an opportunity to review the achievement and take stock of the shortcoming of UNCLOS. On its part, ALCO had organized a special half-day meeting in conjunction with the 51st annual session of ALCO held in Abuja in June last year on the theme Responses to Piracy, International Legal Challenges, as well as during the ALCO Legal Advisors meeting held in New York on 5th November 2012, where Ms. Patricia O'Brien had addressed the legal advisors on this subject. I'm sure the presentation today will look into the achievement of UNCLOS and also at the new challenges. However, in view of some of the significant development that have taken place within ICLOS and ICJ last year, I would like to remind you all that ALCO believe in discussing all matters within a spirit of consensus, and thus we would like to refrain from focusing on any specific bilateral issues. With these words, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Dr. Neeru Chadha, Joint Secretary Legal and Treaty Division, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, for introductory remarks.
Thank you, sir, for those words. And there's a little change in the program that now we will listen to our chief guest, Mr. Pinat Ranjan Chakravarti, to be followed by Dr. Neeru Chadha.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, delegates, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. When I was asked by Neeru to come and address a group like this with so much of legal brain power, I was a little intimidated. I mean, having not really waded into international law in that sense, but I did have a nodding acquaintance as I was discussing before the meeting, that the only thing I now remember is a fellow called Hugo Grotius. And then there's two books by Oppenheimer, two fact books that I remember. And the other one which I was reminded of was the Corfu Channel case. I mean, that's the limit to which I remember my international law. So please forgive me for being pretty ignorant about some of the latest developments in international law. As young diplomats, we were always told to think thrice before saying nothing, which is a good thing for a diplomat, actually. We say that don't open your mouth, keep your ears open. But besides that, I think I believe that international law today has so much more relevance because, and so many new fields have opened up because we live in such a globalized world today. Cyber law, for example, I think I don't know how much of international law has focused on cyber law because it's something that we need very badly, I think, and we need to do things globally on this. But let me then now get to the more serious part of what I have to say. And first of all, let me begin by felicitating the Secretariat of ALCO for taking this initiative for organizing the legal experts meeting to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS as we call it. I also take this opportunity to appreciate the efforts of the Legal and Treaties Division of the Ministry of External Affairs in supporting this meeting, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to this event. The adoption of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, was clearly a seminal lawmaking event of the United Nations that codified and provided a universal legal framework for all human-inspired activities relating to the oceans. UNCLOS governs all aspects of ocean governance, including entitlements of coastal states in different maritime zones, rights of navigation, maritime security, maritime scientific research, marine environment, delimitation of maritime boundaries, and settlement of international disputes. With 164 states parties, the Convention is reaching its near universality, a testament to the significance of the Convention as a significant contribution to the maintenance of peace, justice, and progress for all of us who inhabit this planet. Oceans contain a wide range of mineral, energy, and food resources. UNCLOS created multiple zones to balance the rights of coastal states to the resources and jurisdiction of the sea against the interests of other states for equitable access to those resources and protection of navigational freedoms. It broke important new ground in several areas. It promulgated the crucial exclusive economic zone regime, which reflected the interests of coastal states for jurisdiction over resources in the maritime area of their coasts. ALCO's contribution to development of the concept of the EEZ has been considerable and well recognized. The provisions in the Convention on Transit Passage through Straits used for international navigation, as well as archipelagic sea lanes passage, reflects the interests of the international community that rights of navigation remain unimpeded. In the present era of interdependence, as I said, globalized world, the security and economic prosperity of nations is vitally linked to safety and security of sea lanes of communication. States will need to work together to address common threats to maritime security. Piracy remains a serious concern which threatens security of all states and sea lanes. The security of these lanes is also challenged by other threats such as trafficking in arms, drugs, human beings, and linkages with transnational criminal syndicates. India remains committed to help safeguard the vital sea lanes of the Indo-Pacific and has cooperated in various regional initiatives to combat piracy and transnational organized crimes. There was a time when India was less globalized and 3 to 5% of our economy dependent on trade. Today that's not the situation. Today we are far more dependent on trade, and the contribution of trade to our GDP has shot up to almost, 25-30% now. Hence we have a huge interest in maintaining the sanctity and safety of the sea lanes of communication. Anthropogenic activities in coastal regions are already having a serious impact on the marine environment. With a large population concentrated in coastal areas, pollution of the oceans happens in several ways through discharge of industrial and urban wastes, harbor activities, oil exploration, oil slicks, land runoff, and many other ways. Toxic materials are reaching the oceans through industrial discharges. The time has come for coordinated efforts to protect coastal areas and monitor the health of the oceans. In this context, it is pertinent to note that the outcome document of the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, that is Rio +20, has recognized the importance of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in advancing sustainable development. The mineral resources of the seabed beyond national jurisdiction are a common heritage of mankind, as provided in Part 9 of UNCLOS, which lays down the regime for the exploitation of the resources of the deep sea bed. India is one of pioneer investor for seabed mining. Pursuant to the pioneer investor status, the International Seabed Authority of India allotted International Seabed Authority allotted to India a 150,000 square kilometer mine site in the central Indian Ocean for the seabed mining of polymetallic nodules. India is making efforts to claim other seabed areas that are potential sites for minerals like hydrothermal sulfides and cobalt-rich crusts. As the Indian economy grows bigger, though at a slower rate now, but we do need access to minerals and a lot of other imports, particularly energy, for our economic growth. I hope UNCLOS will continue to develop its normative effect in the international law of the 21st century. In future, it will be important to see how UNCLOS will handle the new challenges by reconciling the new maritime security initiatives with traditional navigation rights and freedoms, strengthen legal regimes to arrest the decline in the health of the marine ecosystems, and regulate ocean space in the Arctic regions as global warming opens up new possibilities for resource exploitation. I must also emphasize the important aspect of capacity building as crucial to these efforts. Many Asian African countries have vast maritime zones and marine resources and have to be equipped with the expertise to exploit the same. These states require availability of economic, legal, navigational, scientific, and technical skills for full and effective implementation of the provisions of UNCLOS, as well as sustainable development of oceans and seas nationally. I believe ALCO, with its extensive experience in matters relating to law of the sea, has an important role to play in helping build such capacity and disseminate information. May I again congratulate ALCO and wish you all success in your deliberations, and I hope you will certainly have a productive conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. May I now call upon Dr. Neeru Chadha, Joint Secretary, to give her introductory remarks.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to thank Asian African Legal Consultative Organization for organizing this important meeting on law of the sea. We, at the Legal and Treaties Division of Ministry of External Affairs, are honored to be associated with this meeting, which will definitely add to our knowledge and also guide all the member states of ALCO in addressing new and future challenges associated with the law of the sea. Today, we are gathered here to commemorate 30 years of adoption of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which was opened for signature on 10th December 1982 at Montego Bay, Jamaica. The convention, one of the most important instruments adopted in the 20th century and referred to as the Constitution of the Oceans and Seas, lays down a comprehensive regime and establishes rules governing all uses of the oceans and their resources. Though this convention addresses and governs all aspects of ocean space, which other experts during the day will deal with, the focus of my remarks is on the diverse threats to the health of the oceans in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The resources and uses of oceans are fundamental to human well-being and development. The long-term sustainability of oceans is therefore critical, and any change that alters the state of oceans can have serious socio-economic consequences for states. Therefore, there is an urgent and continuing need to address the conservation and sustainable use of oceans in areas within and beyond national jurisdictions. Overfishing, destructive fishing practices, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, that is IUU fishing, continue to be grave threats to the conservation, management and sustainable use of biodiversity on the high seas. To combat IUU fishing, it is essential to give priority to compliance and enforcement measures, listing of vessels, and developing and implementing integrating monitoring, control and surveillance packages. The agreement on port-state measures adopted by Food and Agricultural Organization to prevent, deter and eliminate IUU fishing provides a set of highly effective tools to be used by port states to combat IUU fishing. This is expected to block the flow of IUU caught fish into national and international markets. Further, in a landmark step, United Nations General Assembly prohibited bottom fishing in high seas unless environmental impact assessments are conducted and regulations are put into place beforehand to prevent the destruction of deep sea biodiversity. There has been some progress in identifying and protecting some vulnerable marine ecosystems, but measures taken till date by states and regional fishing management organizations are still far from comprehensive. It needs to be emphasized that the continuing contribution of fisheries to sustainable development depends on the health of functioning productive ecosystems and on their optimal utilization. It is thus important to sustainably manage fish stocks and protect vulnerable marine ecosystems, and thus to find a balance between sustainable use and conservation. The management and governance of high seas areas presents a formidable challenge for the international community, as development of an effective regime for the protection of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction is seen to be circumscribing some of the traditional high seas freedoms. Marine protected areas are seen to be an important marine ecosystem management tool for securing protection from threats to marine biological diversity. The developing literature on MPAs reveals the potential benefits that they could offer, not only to the resilience of vulnerable marine ecosystems, but also to the productivity of fisheries. However, in respect of MPAs in areas beyond national jurisdiction, information on governance aspects and costs and benefits is still very sparse, and it is not possible to apply and manage apply management tools consistently across all oceans. It is therefore essential to continue to develop and facilitate the use of additional approaches and tools for conserving and managing vulnerable marine diversity. The regulations on prospecting and exploration in the area for polymetallic nodules, polymetallic sulfides, and cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts adopted by the International Seabed Authority are an important input with regard to the protection and preservation of marine environment and the biodiversity of the area. New threats to biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction are emerging from bioprospecting and geoengineering activities like open ocean iron fertilization, which is used as a climate change mitigation technique. Bioprospecting, that is the search for commercial development of valuable natural compounds, is one such new use. Deep sea organisms, having the ability to adapt to extreme environments, have been subject to considerable investigation for their biotechnology potential. The growing commercial interest in deep seabed research and use of the unique genetic resources that this research has discovered raises some very crucial questions. To put them briefly, some of the issues that need attention are: who owns these resources? Are they common heritage of mankind? How should they be used? As several scientific studies have raised concern regarding uncontrolled collection and exploitation of genetic resources from the deep sea bed. And how should the benefits of this research be distributed? There are no international rules and standards which govern these new uses, and modern conservation principles such as the ecosystem approach and precautionary approach are not consistently incorporated in such researches. A combination of measures, including monitoring, scientific investigation, and improved governance, are required to prevent or reduce harmful impacts of such activities on biological diversity. The outcome document of the Rio +20 summit in this regard calls on UNGA to take a decision in 2 years on the development of an implementing agreement under the UNCLOS regarding marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is expected to address inter alia some of the above mentioned concerns. At Rio Plus 20, there was also a move forward on many other issues dealing with oceans, including ocean acidification, marine debris, IUU fishing, and reaffirming of the WSSD targets for restoring fish stocks. The Secretary General of the United Nations has launched the Oceans Compact, which sets out a strategic vision for the UN system to deliver more coherently and effectively on its ocean-related mandates. Consistent with the Rio Plus 20 outcome, the Compact is expected to provide a platform to help countries protect the ocean's natural resources, restore their full food production to help people whose livelihoods depend on the sea, and increase awareness and knowledge about the management of the oceans. To conclude, I would emphasize that the deep seabed research is still largely the domain of select developed countries. Therefore, it is necessary that there be an increased flow of scientific data and information and transfer of knowledge to developing countries so as to improve their understanding and knowledge of oceans and deep seas and its uses, and also the extent and vulnerability of deep sea biodiversity and ecosystems. The Oceans Compact, it is hoped, would contribute in this regard to the knowledge of developing countries and help them in using the resources of the ocean in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Now I would like to invite our former Secretary General, Mr. B. Sen, for his keynote address.
Your Excellency, the Secretary General of the ASCO, Dr. Ahmad Mohammed, His Excellency Dr. Mr. Chakrabarti, Mr. Matthias, and Dr. Niru Chadda, ladies and gentlemen, I deem it a great privilege to be asked to speak on the occasion of the anniversary, on the 30th anniversary of the conclusion of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is often described as the Constitution of the Oceans. The Convention, together with 4 resolutions, forming an integral part of a package, was adopted at the 11th session of the conference in New York in 30th April 1982. The conference held its final session at Montego Bay in Jamaica from the 6th to 10th December 82 for adoption of the final act. The convention as adopted contained 320 articles grouped under 17 parts, together with 9 annexes, which include the regime of the territorial sea, the high seas, international seabed area, marine environment, scientific research, and settlement of disputes. ALCO's contribution, it was previously known as ALCC, so I go back saying ALCC. ALCO's contribution to the emergence of this convention could be said to be threefold, namely to assist the developing countries of Asia and Africa, of the Asian African region, to participate effectively in the negotiations. Secondly, in helping to build a consensus among the Asian African states on several issues, and to bring about an understanding with the Latin American states on several issues. And finally, in helping in developing some of the concepts which ultimately found acceptance of the world community. I mean in particular the concept of the exclusive economic zone, the archipelagic states, as well as the regime of the straits and used for international navigation, which eventually helped in the emergence of an acceptable passage to settle the question of the breadth of the territorial sea. It might not be out of place for me to refer briefly at the outset to the historical background on this occasion, which dates back to the years immediately following the First World War and the establishment of the League of Nations. The colonial powers, mainly Britain and France, still dominated the scene. The German colonies in Africa had changed hands, the Ottoman Empire had disintegrated, and most of its territories had come under the League of Nations mandate. Insofar as the oceans are concerned, the three basic principles, namely a 3-mile limit for the territorial sea, the freedom of the seas, and the piracy as a crime against all nations, continued to prevail. Nevertheless, some thoughts had begun to surface as to whether the breadth of the territorial sea, which is fixed at 3 miles, should not be reviewed. This was because the gun range of the naval ships had proved to be much wider than the 3-mile limit, and further the fishing interests of many nations, especially in Latin America, sought a wider belt within which they could exercise certain economic rights. These issues were to be examined by the Committee of Jurists within the League of Nations, which could have been perhaps the first attempt at codification of the law of the oceans. The League, however, could not make any progress due to disagreement among its members and other preoccupations, and finally due to the outbreak of the Second World War. During the war years, some other important developments took place, that is the advancement of the scientific knowledge, the need for finding new resources including petroleum, led some nations, particularly in Latin America, to lay claims to larger areas for their territorial seas. The discovery of petroleum in the seabed in the Gulf of Padua in 1942, followed by the Truman Declaration of 1944, laying claim to the areas of seabed adjacent to the coasts of America, led the way to similar declaration by many other nations. With the end of the Second World War and the establishment of the United Nations, there was again almost a unanimous clamor for re-examination of all aspects of the law of the oceans. That was why, when the International Law Commission was established in 1948, one of the priority items taken up was the law of the sea. The Commission examined a whole range of issues and came up with its recommendations by way of preparation of draft articles to serve as a preparatory material for negotiations of a multilateral treaty in 1956, the Commission finished its work. Thereafter, the United Nations proceeded to convene the first conference on plenipotentiary, the law of the sea, to work out a unified regime for the oceans, which met in 1958 for a period of around 10 weeks. The conference succeeded in drawing up 4 conventions, including one on relating to the territorial sea and the contiguous zone, the regime of the high seas, and the regime of the continental shelf. The conference, however, failed to resolve the issue of the breadth of the territorial waters, which was due to the fact of divergence of opinion, great divergence of opinion. Many of the issues which found themselves codified in the 4 conventions were new, such as the concept of a contiguous zone for the purpose of sanitation and customs regulations, the concept of continental shelf adjoining the coastal states, which had earlier found expression in the various unilateral declarations made during the war years. The conference made relatively speedy progress, and the achievements were not negligible by any standards. This was because the conference had a substantially meticulously prepared draft before it drawn up by the International Law Commission, and the states represented were fewer in number. In addition to the maritime nations, the main participation of the third world at that conference was from Latin America. Since the states in Asia had emerged as independent only a few years earlier, and the African continent, barring a few territories, was still under colonial rule. Recognizing the urgency of settling the issue of the breadth of the territorial sea left open by the 1958 conference, the United Nations convened a second conference which met in the early part of 1960. The difficulty in tackling the issue was that, on the one hand, maritime nations as well as states with distant water fishing fleets continued to stick to the traditional 3-mile limit, whilst for the territorial sea, in the interest of freedom of navigation. On the other hand, the newly independent states, and as well as the states in Latin America, wanted a much larger belt for the sea. Ultimately, a solution seemed to be in sight, where a compromise was struck for a 6-mile territorial sea, during which, along with a 6-mile contiguous zone at the initiative of Canada, but it failed to get the required 2/3 majority by just one vote, and that vote was one of the sponsors who backed out the last moment. You know which one it was. The failure of the second United Nations conference gradually gave rise to a chaotic situation, and many of the newly independent countries and several Latin American states began to unilaterally proclaim the limits of the territorial waters, varying from 12 miles to 200 miles, leading to uncertainties and impediment to navigation, trade and commerce. Another fresh development took place when President Nixon of the United States proclaimed that there remained areas of the seabed and subsoil beyond national jurisdictions which could be exploited for the benefit of all nations. The United Nations promptly proclaimed that area to be a common heritage of mankind and established a committee to work out appropriate regime for the purpose. While the Seabed Committee was in session and making some progress, a large number of countries suggested convening of another conference on the law of the sea to deal with the remaining items. According to this call, acceding to this call, the General Assembly of the United Nations decided in 1969 to convene a third United Nations conference. The problems that then arose, what issues the conference was going to tackle. The maritime nations and some of the states which had participated in earlier conferences wanted a few selective issues to be taken up, whilst many of the countries, particularly in Africa, said we haven't had opportunity to participate in the earlier conferences, so let us reopen the whole lot of issues. And that prevailed. And ultimately, the voice prevailed and the whole all the issues were opened up. Now at that stage, the decision being taken to reopen and re-examine all issues, including those which found place in the Fourth Geneva Convention of '58, a question arose as to which body was to prepare the preliminary text for negotiations. This task was then entrusted to the Seabed Committee with an extended membership and the 4 subcommittees. It was at this stage that the question arose as to how the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa were going to prepare themselves to participate in the debate and the preparatory work of the Seabed Committee. One option for a number of countries was to take guidance from their former colonial rulers, which many of them did. But then there were others who wanted to take an independent view and examine for themselves the issues involved with the resources at their command. The Asian African Legal Consultative Committee, which had only a membership of 12 countries at that time, was called upon to assist in the process. The ALCC, now renamed ALCO, had one great advantage in that it had Japan, a maritime nation and a developed country, among its most active members. It had countries like India, Indonesia, Egypt and Sri Lanka and a few others, which already had among its personnel those who were highly trained in Western universities. The collective expertise expressed in the committee's sessions with subcommittee meetings and working groups helped in the formulation of ideas and preparatory material. The result of this collective exercise was then made available for the common use of the member states, and was also made available to any non-member Asian African country which requested for it. This was very widely made use of, and as a matter of fact, the membership of the committee went up from 12 to 40, and even countries outside the region often referred to the material prepared by us. The Seabed Committee in due course succeeded in preparing a negotiating text in 1975 and revised in 1976 on the basis of various proposals discussed at various forums, including the ALCC meetings. The negotiating texts were then analyzed by the committee's secretariat, and at times alternative solutions were suggested which emerged out of the various meetings arranged by the ALCO. These were then distributed widely for use of members and non-members countries, and as a matter of fact, the committee's sessions were so widely attended by observers from countries outside the region that the ALCC sessions virtually became a mini negotiating forum for various ideas and proposals. One of the proposals which emerged out of discussion in the ALCC and found wide acceptance among the nations was for an economic zone beyond the territorial sea. The idea came up during one of the subcommittee meetings of the ALCC, which is being held in Geneva at the same time as the UN Seabed Committee. The idea of an economic zone had its origin in the concept of the contiguous zone, which had found acceptance of the Geneva Convention. It was just the extension of the contiguous zone, but higher rights, more rights. In essence, it was really an extension of the concept of the contiguous zone, which found compromise and was made to find a compromise solution between a larger territorial sea and the concept of contiguous zone was intended to be widened in the proposal of the economic zone so as to include exploitation of the resources of the zone relatively for the purpose of the coastal states, exclusively for the purpose of the coastal states. In the initial stages, no one seemed to be clear as to what would be the breadth of the breadth of the economic zone, or what kind of jurisdiction the coastal states would exercise within that zone, or what rights the other states should enjoy. At the outset, there was strong resistance, quite understandably, from the maritime states, which strictly adhered to the concept of freedom of the oceans. But gradually they reconciled to the acceptance of the idea once they were assured that the freedom of navigation would not be affected, and in fact many of the maritime nations later came to welcome the idea once they realized that they would be also benefited by the exclusive utilization of the resources of the sea adjoining their coast. A formula was worked out to provide that the coastal state will have all sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring and exploiting, conserving and managing the natural resources, whether living or non-living, of the seabed and the subsoil and the superjacent waters, and with regard to other activities for the economic exploitation and exploration of the zone. All states, however, would enjoy freedom of navigation and overflight, as also freedom to lay submarine cables and pipelines and other lawful uses of the sea. Another problem then arose as to what would be the breadth of the economic zone. The delegation suggested 50, others some 100 miles, but the Latin Americans stuck to the view that for the 200-mile limit, which was to some extent satisfied the desire for a 200-mile territorial sea, which was unilaterally already proclaimed by some of those countries. The conference reached a compromise by giving in to the demand for the Latins of 200 miles for the exclusive economic zone. In return, the Latin Americans accepted the 12-mile territorial sea. That was the bargain, that you have 12-mile territorial sea and you have to take 200 miles of the economic zone. That was the bargain reached. Another concept which came out of the deliberations of the ALCC was that of the archipelagic states. I remember Minister Mendoza of the Philippines explaining to one of the sessions of the ALCC as to why they needed the sea surrounded by the group of islands, forming integral part of the territory of the state, to be regarded as their internal waters. This, he said, was necessitated in the interest of security, defense, and communication with different parts of their territories. I mean, Indonesia, which also basically agreed with this idea, had initially claimed a somewhat different type of regime. However, as the ideas were being discussed and developed within the Forum of the Asian African Committee, Indonesia and Philippines were persuaded to unify their stand as to the applicable regime and present a common front for negotiations to the world powers. Initially, these claims looked to be exaggerated and were totally opposed by the maritime powers and many others having navigational interests, because it would lock up the entire segments of the oceans from access to navigation, and in any event would enormously increase the costs of carriage of goods by sea, and the ships would need to take a circuitous route to travel from one continent to another. Finally, a solution was reached by the time the negotiating texts were drawn up by the Seabed Committee in 1975, and that was that the archipelagic state was to enjoy sovereign rights over the archipelagic waters encompassed within the baseline connecting the islands. Ships of all nations were accorded right of passage to designated sea lanes as designated by the archipelagic states. It was another part of a package which ALCC was able to broker. This time proposals came from the other side, and we persuaded in our members to accept the proposal. Now, there was another part of a package which ALCC was able to broker to promoting acceptance of the special regime of the passage through straits used for international navigation. This came as a proposal from maritime nations in return for acceptance of a 12-mile territorial sea, which was the basic concern of the most of the developing nations. The provisions concerning straits used for international navigation guarantee that all ships and aircraft enjoy the right of what is termed as transit passage through straits which are used for international navigation between one part of the high seas or as an exclusive economic zone and another part of the high seas or exclusive economic zone. The provision for a regime of transit passage represented a compromise between the concept of innocent passage exercisable in relation to territorial sea and the concept of free passage over the high seas. This had to be worked out by reason of the fact that the large number of states, numbering over 100, used for international navigation, which had formed part of the high seas with a 3-mile limit for the territorial sea, would be encompassed within the territorial waters of the states. Bordering the states with 12-mile limit was to be adopted as the breadth of the territorial sea. Maritime powers had insisted that their acceptance of a 12-mile limit for the territorial sea would be dependent upon an appropriate regime being worked out for unimpeded passage of ships through the straits. Another area where ALCC pioneered the work was the interest of landlocked states, as most of these, I think 14 out of 20, were found to be located within the Asian African region. The landlocked states, which are not given even a hearing during the 1958 conference, were able to bargain special regimes for themselves which included right of access to the sea and freedom of transit through its neighboring states by all means of transport. The developing countries another topic I go on to, the developing countries in Asian Africa originally showed little interest in working out the regime for the international seabed area, because it seemed that the area would be out of reach for exploitation by themselves, as they would not have the necessary technology or the monetary resources at their command. They were satisfied with what was contained in the single negotiating text issued by the Seabed Committee in 1975, which had by and large reflected the thinking of the developing countries, namely that all activities in the area shall be conducted by or in association with the International Seabed Authority to be established under the proposed convention. However, the position radically changed when the revised negotiating text the next year, 1976, it was contemplated that the access to the area should be available to the International Seabed Authority as well as also to the states, parties, and entities sponsored by them in the maritime in the manner provided for in the negotiating text, best known as the parallel system. The group of 77 were initially opposed to the acceptance of this system, but after protracted negotiations, the group showed in readiness to work on the basis of the parallel system for a period of 20 years by way of a compromise solution. I think India was given the status of one of the pioneers investors. The developing nations also began to actively participate in the negotiation on this topic after the introduction of the several negotiating texts, after the negotiating text was revised, and since then the AICC sessions began to be utilized for formulating, examining, modifying and improving the various suggestions put forward by various interest groups. I think I could go on and on, but there's not enough time, so I'll just do one more thing, the scientific research. Another area which is of concern to developing nations was that of scientific research, which among countries, rightly or wrongly, thought was not in the interest of their security. But again, many misunderstandings could be resolved through the good offices of the ALCO sessions, and finally the conference came to an end in April 1982 with the adoption of the Convention and 4 resolutions. And of course it is one of the most accepted conventions in the, I think, in the history of international relations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency, for those excellent remarks. And I think as an employee of ALCO, I feel even prouder to be associated with this organization. With these words, now I invite Mr. Stephen Matthias, the Assistant Secretary General for Legal Affairs, United Nations, for his inaugural address.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let me open my remarks by conveying to you the greetings of the Legal Counsel of the United Nations, Miss Patricia O'Brien. She was most honored to have been invited here to deliver the inaugural address. Unfortunately, urgent business kept her in New York, so I've come in her stead. But she is looking forward to my report about the proceedings here and is anxiously interested in these subjects. It is a great pleasure for me to be here to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the UNCLOS. 2012 saw a flurry of activities to mark this important milestone at United Nations headquarters and around the world. They included a panel discussion at UN headquarters on World Oceans Day, 8th of June last year, a commemoration held and a declaration adopted at the 22nd meeting of states parties of the UNCLOS, as well as a full day of plenary meetings devoted to the convention in the General Assembly of the United Nations on 10 December of 2012, the actual anniversary of the signature. I would like to begin my remarks by recalling the historically proactive role played by ALCO and its member states with regard to UNCLOS. Notably, the item Law of the Sea has been on ALCO's agenda since its establishment in 1956. And we just heard a great deal from former Secretary General B. Sen concerning ALCO's vital role with respect to the negotiation of the convention. Being surrounded by eminent experts here on the Law of the Sea, I don't need to recall how the development of the Law of the Sea is inextricably connected to the development of contemporary international law. But this meeting does provide an important opportunity for us to reflect on how the content of the Law of the Sea Convention was shaped by the growing influence of